Suddenly, brazen trespassers invade his land, forcing him to recall his martial past. With a single powerful strike, he proves underestimating a farmer can be fatal. It turns out these thugs are linked to a powerful cartel bent on revenge. The sheriff warns of an impending threat and an assassination plot against Scott. Scott refuses to surrender his family's legacy and prepares to face an unpredictable enemy. Tension rises with each passing night, and sooner or later, the fate of this story will be decided in one place. Stay with us if you want to find out how this story ends, and don't forget to subscribe, because there are many more exciting plots ahead just for you. Late into a warm summer evening, the vast fields of the Adkins farm stretched out like a soft quilt of alternating gold and deep green. The property had long been nurtured by the devoted hands of Scott Adkins's parents, who had poured their energy into coaxing delicate crops from the soil. When they passed, the farm's ownership fell into Scott's care, and he brought with him the discipline and focus he had once devoted to training his body and refining his martial prowess. Long before he was a farmer, he had been recognized worldwide for his skill in martial arts, showcased in action films that had granted him fame and financial security. Yet Scott rarely mentioned those achievements to the neighbors and friends who came to buy his produce. What truly mattered now was the legacy left by his mother and father, and the promise he had made to preserve their land in a condition that would honor them. He had taken to farm life with surprising ease. His early mornings now involved rising with the sun, performing quick stretches to maintain flexibility, then working the soil until late afternoon. He specialized in rare crops, from vibrant heirloom tomatoes that shimmered a beautiful shade of orange to medicinal herbs whose seeds were imported from distant parts of the globe. Though physically taxing, the work was honest, and he found that each day offered small rewards, like spotting a fresh bud on a fragile plant or testing the sweetness of a newly ripened fruit in the orchard. That evening, as the sun began its descent, Scott stepped away from his modest farmhouse to survey the fields. A short walk along the perimeter fence gave him a clear view of the orchard, the vegetable gardens, and the few grazing animals he kept more for his affection for them than any practical need. The gentle whinny of a single horse accompanied him as he proceeded down a dirt path, heading toward an old wooden barn that stood a small distance from the main house. The air felt warm and pleasant on his skin. The temperature had not yet dipped, and a perfect glow remained in the sky. Tall grasses danced in a lazy breeze, carrying with it the scent of earth and faint traces of the flowering plants that bordered the fields. Scott found comfort in this quiet ambience, reminding him of childhood evenings long before he could land a jumping spin kick or duck a swing from a stuntman's prop weapon. Though he remained physically powerful and capable of defense, he rarely had reason to recall such skills on the farm. His life had settled into a pattern of planting, harvesting, and the occasional trip into town for supplies. It was a satisfying way to exist, free of vanity or the need to prove himself. His reflections, however, were interrupted by a muffled sound that gradually grew louder. It was the unmistakable roar of engines, specifically trucks moving swiftly over nearby gravel. He continued walking, though his senses sharpened. Soon, 2 pickup trucks came into view, each loaded with half a dozen young individuals who were rowdy and boisterous. Their vehicles rumbled across the road that edged Scott's property, music blaring so loudly that it invaded the serene farmland like an unwelcome intruder. He noticed the tall silhouettes of the men as they stopped near the boundary fence, evidently searching for excitement or amusement. The strangers spilled out of the trucks with cans of cheap beer in hand, still shouting jokes at each other. Their gestures were wild, their postures aggressive, and the volume of their voices made it obvious they were not in a cordial frame of mind. Their words were slurred with drink, and they eyed the farm with clear disdain. Scott did not immediately confront them. Instead, he observed from some distance, hoping their visit was a random occurrence and that they might drive off once they realized there was no party or spectacle. But the men displayed no intention of leaving. Quite the contrary, they looked around for someone to antagonize. In their drunken state, they seemed to seek a target for mockery and intimidation. When they spotted him near the fence, one of them beckoned with a dismissive wave. Another, thin and jittery, made a comment to his friend, pointing at Scott. Though he could not hear their words precisely, he could see from their body language that they were sneering. They gestured for him to come nearer, calling out to him as if he were their servant. The men referred to him in cruel terms, insulting his appearance as well as the farm. One of them demanded water, sneering that a dirty farmer should fetch it for them if he knew what was good for him. Despite their attitude, Scott tried to avoid a direct confrontation. He wanted no trouble, and he hoped that by offering a gesture of hospitality, he might defuse the tension. He walked slowly back to the farmhouse, retrieved a pitcher of water, and approached them at the fence line, carefully extending the handle in their direction. But his attempt at kindness only incited more contempt. One of the young men seized the pitcher and, with a theatrical snarl, hurled its contents back at Scott, drenching his shirt. Laughter followed, harsh, mocking laughter that cut through the evening air. The man's companions patted each other on the back, clearly proud of the disrespect they had shown. It was a moment charged with antagonism. Scott's expression turned firm but not enraged. Water dripped from his collar, and his muscles tensed involuntarily, bracing for what might come next. The men made several provocative gestures, cursing and insulting him further. Scott, using a measured and calm tone, warned them that they were trespassing on private property and insisted they leave. His instruction was met with a new wave of insults, all of which pointed to the same conclusion: they believed he was merely a timid farmer, a man unprepared for physical conflict. Emboldened by the belief that they greatly outnumbered him, the intruders advanced. They pledged to teach him a lesson and threatened to beat him senseless right there by his own fence. Their mistake was underestimating his capabilities. For years, Scott had honed his body and mind in rigorous training sessions for both film work and personal mastery. His reflexes were as sharp as ever, and his stance shifted on instinct as soon as they approached. The first attacker lunged recklessly, brandishing a fist aimed at Scott's jaw. With minimal movement, Scott evaded the blow, pivoting smoothly to land a decisive kick into the man's leg. A sharp crack rang out. The man dropped to the ground, writhing in agony. The second, startled by how swiftly his comrade had been incapacitated, tried to grab Scott from behind, but Scott seized the man's arm, twisted it upward, and forced the elbow into an unnatural angle. An audible pop followed, and the second aggressor's arm went limp. The third man attempted a more direct assault, charging forward with both arms extended. Scott delivered a controlled hip throw that sent the attacker crashing into the dirt. The impact left him unconscious, his head rolling sideways as his body slackened. In the ensuing moments, the remaining men were paralyzed by surprise. Their target had just neutralized half of their group with startling speed. Hesitation only lasted an instant before they, too, rushed at him, either unable or unwilling to grasp the hopelessness of their efforts. Scott sidestepped one while driving a powerful elbow into the fourth man's torso, sending him staggering back as the air left his lungs. The fifth attacker swung wildly, but Scott hammered him with two rapid punches that dropped him to the ground. The sixth man found himself alone, his friends either incapacitated or groaning on the dirt. Consumed by desperation and a false sense of bravado, he reached for a concealed firearm, pulling it out with a trembling hand. For a fraction of a second, it seemed as though the conflict might escalate beyond fists. The muzzle flashed as he aimed, but Scott's reflexes guided him. He stepped out of the weapon's direct line, trapping the attacker's wrist and twisting it away. His other hand clamped around the man's shoulder, forcing him off balance. In one swift movement, Scott gained control of the pistol and turned it against its owner, discharging two shots that ripped through the man's legs. The attacker shrieked in agony as he collapsed in the grass. Dropping the magazine from the gun and ejecting the final round, Scott then flung the empty weapon away so it could not be used again. He towered over the wounded men, drenched partially in sweat, partially in the spilled water, and thoroughly intent on ending the confrontation. His posture was enough to communicate that any further provocation would be met with more violence. Though he said very little, his presence alone seemed enough to crush what remained of the intruder's resolve. The men hobbled back to their pickups, dragging their injured companions, cursing and howling threats as they went. One glowered at Scott with eyes burning from the pain of his shattered bones. That man hissed a promise of revenge, accusing Scott of crossing the wrong people. But for the moment, the threat seemed hollow, and the intruders drove off in a haze of dust and engine noise. Scott took a few minutes to calm his breathing. Adrenaline still surged in his veins, and his thoughts churned. He had come to this place precisely to avoid such violent encounters, hoping for a life of quiet discipline. Yet, he couldn't deny the sense of certainty he felt in how he had handled himself. The farmland still lay peaceful all around, though the mood was now darkened by the lingering tension. The sun was nearly gone, the horizon painted in swathes of burning orange and crimson. Once he felt composed enough, he headed inside, removing his soaked shirt. He carefully checked his arms and torso for bruises or cuts. Only a few minor scrapes marked his skin. He washed off the dust and reeled with the knowledge that what had just happened would have repercussions. Those young men were not merely drunken drifters. They had left with wild threats on their tongues, references to powerful contacts, and talk of vengeance. Early the next morning, as Scott was examining the damage to his fence, the local sheriff arrived on the property, stepping out of a patrol car with a concerned expression. He had known Scott's family for years and understood that Scott was no ordinary civilian. It was clear something urgent had prompted his visit, and though the sheriff kept his words reserved and cautious, he wasted no time relaying what he had learned through local channels. The men who had attacked Scott were affiliated with a dangerous cartel, known for trafficking and intimidation in nearby regions. The sheriff conveyed that, in light of their humiliating defeat, the group would surely seek retribution. Worse yet, the highest ranks of the cartel were rumored to have placed a price on Scott's head, vowing to eradicate not only him but also to destroy or seize the farmland he cherished. It was an announcement that carried a grim seriousness, for Scott knew the nature of such organizations. They had resources, manpower, and the willingness to resort to savage methods to uphold their reputation. Though disturbed by the news, Scott responded with measured composure. He assured the sheriff that he would remain on guard and that he appreciated the warning. The older lawman hesitated, looking around the farm as though expecting trouble to arrive at any moment. He suggested that Scott consider leaving town temporarily or relocating. But Scott had made a promise to himself long ago that he would not run from threats. He had pledged to protect the land inherited from his parents, to defend it at all costs. No amount of intimidation would drive him away. With a heavy sigh, the sheriff departed, concerned but resigned. In the quiet that followed, Scott walked the fence line once more, contemplating the extremes to which this situation might escalate. He allowed his mind to drift to the times he had played the hero in front of cameras, elaborate fight choreography, carefully scripted stunts, and retakes that ensured perfection on film. Those experiences felt so distant now. This was not a set, and these antagonists were not actors. If they came for him, it would be a real fight, with real bullets, real consequences, and no second chances if he miscalculated. Still, he did not lose heart. The very discipline that had enabled him to become an accomplished martial artist and a successful actor fueled his resolve. If protecting his home meant fortifying its defenses, then he would do so. If it meant standing firm against an onslaught, he would find a way. Each breeze that passed over the fields served as a reminder that life still teemed in the soil around him, that the crops continued their silent, steady growth, and that the land itself was worth fighting for. That night, he put in motion the beginnings of a plan. He inventoried what resources he had, from tools and wires in his barn to the sturdy boards of the fence that could be reinforced. Over the years, he had collected a few items that were not typical for a farmer, some small traps, materials for building improvised barricades, and the knowledge of where and how to acquire more specialized gear if necessary. Although his lifestyle emphasized peace and tranquility, he was not naive about the dangers that sometimes lurked in the shadows, especially when one's name circulated in unsavory circles. He slept lightly, awakened occasionally by the imagined sound of distant truck engines or the rustle of an animal stepping on dried leaves. While no direct threat materialized that night, he realized that the tranquility of his life had been irrevocably disturbed. The next day, he began the first of several steps to prepare. He surveyed potential vantage points, especially around the barn's roof, which offered a wide view of the property. He considered angles, distances, and spots where an ambush might be most likely. He also thought about using the natural features of the farm to his advantage. Overgrown sections, small groves of trees, irrigation ditches, all of these could be turned into strategic assets if approached correctly. Word traveled fast in small communities, and soon the farmhands from a neighboring property, along with a couple of friends from town, offered their support. Some brought leftover scrap metal or lumber to help reinforce barricades. Others left behind steel traps that could deter intruders if placed carefully. Though they respected Scott's formidable skills, they recognized the unrelenting nature of the cartel and understood that a single man might be overwhelmed by sheer numbers. But Scott never asked for them to risk themselves unnecessarily. While he accepted the materials they brought, he emphasized they need not stay and place themselves in harm's way. Days passed without further incident, which might have lulled a less vigilant individual into complacency. But Scott had encountered enough misfortune in his life to recognize a storm gathering on the horizon. He maintained his farmland responsibilities as usual, watering, weeding, inspecting the orchard, yet his mind was consistently split, half on the daily tasks, half on the possibility of a sudden attack. Even the local sheriff, though well-intentioned, could not fully protect him if the cartel decided to strike. They could arrive at any time, perhaps under the cover of darkness or disguised as ordinary travelers. For the moment, calm prevailed on the surface. The crops continued to flourish, the sun rose and set predictably, and the farm animals went about their routines. Scott stood vigilant, awaiting the next inevitable move by those who had threatened him. He remembered the defiant promise made by that wounded aggressor, the bitter sting in his voice. It was an omen of conflict yet to unfold, and in that final moment of peace, Scott reaffirmed his intention to stand fast. No matter what might come. He remained by the orchard as the late afternoon glow turned the sky into a masterpiece of pink and orange hues, convinced that his life as a farmer and his life as a master of martial arts were about to collide in a most violent manner. There could be no turning back now. Shadows stretched across the farmland as the day wore on, and the old barn's weathered timbers glowed in the waning sunlight. Scott busied himself with reinforcing an improvised perimeter, walking carefully along the orchard rows to conceal small-scale devices he had crafted from wires, stakes, and other salvaged items. While most farmers would have been content to rely on a decent fence, he had devised layers of protection that reached far beyond a typical rural setup. He felt no pride in turning his family's home into a defensive stronghold, yet he recognized the necessity of doing so. He arranged tripwire triggered traps near strategic entry points, checked the calibrations on homemade motion sensors, and tested small remote alarms that would alert him to any large-scale movement. His training had taught him an exacting approach to every task, whether it involved perfecting a complex sequence of martial arts maneuvers or learning how to manage specialized equipment. He drew on that same focus now, ensuring each device would do its job reliably if the cartel launched a raid. He knew that battles were rarely won by raw strength alone. A steady mind and attention to detail could tip the scales in his favor, particularly when confronting superior numbers. A handful of neighbors remained quietly supportive. Although they dared not openly challenge the cartel, they sometimes helped by keeping an eye out on the roads, or by bringing him materials that might prove useful. One farmer, a reserved man who had once served in the military, lent Scott a few surplus items from his time in service. Another neighbor offered old lumber that had been stacked behind a barn for years, which could be repurposed into barricades or hidden vantage points. Despite these contributions, Scott preferred to work alone when it came to the most sensitive preparations. He did not want others implicated or endangered by his personal conflict. Over the next few days, he spent nights on edge, often waking before dawn to stand by the barn's loft window and peer into the darkness. Each time, only the motion of nocturnal animals or the flicker of moonlit tree branches disturbed the silence. He wondered if the cartel had decided to abandon their pursuit. Yet the memory of that young man's seething expression as he limped away and the sheriff's stern warning told him otherwise. Silence often preceded the most violent storms. On the third day after the sheriff's visit, one of Scott's newly installed perimeter sensors gave a faint crackle of static through the small handheld receiver he carried. There were no visible headlights on the main road, and from where he stood in the upper level of the barn, the farmland appeared undisturbed. He waited, meticulously adjusting a pair of binoculars, scanning the distance for any unnatural movement. Eventually, faint shapes materialized on the dusty horizon, several vehicles, possibly trucks similar to the ones he had seen before, but far more numerous and better organized. Through the binoculars, he picked out at least 4 distinct vehicles, each carrying multiple passengers. They advanced steadily, spread out so as not to ride in each other's dust clouds. The lead truck slowed, presumably receiving instructions from someone inside or from a radio transmission. The absence of loud music or raucous laughter marked a stark contrast to the earlier group that had arrived drunken and overconfident. This time, the cartel's enforcers came sober, armed, and bearing a purpose that left no doubt about their violent intent. Scott made a final check of the barn interior, verifying that the hidden turret mechanisms were primed and that the supply of ammunition was in place. He had taken great care to embed these mechanisms inside bales of hay, concealing them so that a quick glance would reveal nothing more than typical farm clutter. Each concealed turret was rigged to fire when motion sensors were tripped in certain areas, though he had also installed manual overrides to prevent indiscriminate firing. He wanted to avoid harming innocents if by some slim chance they wandered into the fray. He then made his way to a secondary vantage point on the roof. He had replaced a few old shingles with hinged wooden panels that allowed him to observe and, if necessary, to position a sniper rifle he had hidden in a sealed trunk years ago. The weapon was finely calibrated, with a scope that would allow him to strike distant targets before they even realized his position. Though he disliked the idea of escalating the conflict to lethal force, the danger posed by these men left no room for compromise. A short while later, the vehicles approached the farm boundary. Gravel and dirt plumed behind them as they skidded to a halt near the fence. Scott's traps extended well beyond this point, planted in shallow ditches and masked by sparse vegetation. He watched through the scope as the men poured out in formation. They wore dark clothing and carried rifles, shotguns, and handguns, each piece of weaponry brandished with practiced confidence. Some of them advanced warily, while others moved with brazen arrogance, scanning the farmhouse for signs of their intended target. Their caution evaporated the moment they tripped the first cluster of hidden mines. A thunderous blast erupted on the eastern boundary, consuming 2 men in a cloud of shrapnel-laden dust. Another explosion followed within seconds, triggered by the frantic steps of those trying to retreat. Additional devices unleashed a storm of debris, leaving some men staggering, dazed by the concussive force. The panic that surged through the group was immediate. The realization dawned that they had walked into a meticulously prepared battleground, and the ensuing chaos shattered any illusions of an easy assault. Scott remained motionless, adjusting the scope of his rifle with steady hands. From that vantage, he could see at least 5 men down, some killed instantly by the blasts, others grievously wounded and crawling for cover. Their fellow attackers scattered in different directions, shouting commands and urgent warnings. Unable to find the source of the threat, several men attempted to circle around to the west side of the property, hoping to breach the fence where no mines had detonated yet. In preparation for exactly that contingency, Scott had placed a sequence of smaller traps and tripwires. The first of these was triggered just moments later, clamping around the leg of an unwary man who let out a cry as the steel jaws seized him. Another was caught in a punji-style pit, concealed by leaves and soil, leaving him with deep puncture wounds in both feet. These injuries threw the entire squad into disarray, dividing their forces into those who pressed forward and those who tried to help the fallen. At that critical moment, Scott activated a remote mechanism that brought the turret guns to life. Hidden within the seemingly innocent mounds of hay, the barrels emerged with a mechanical hum. He triggered the nearest one first, focusing on a cluster of cartel gunmen who had taken partial cover behind the fence. A sudden hail of bullets strafed the yard, knocking several men off their feet in a matter of seconds. Panic and shouts rippled through the group as they realized that a fully automatic defense system lay in wait. Some fired blindly toward the barn, but their shots ricocheted harmlessly off wooden boards reinforced with steel plates on the inside. A second turret unleashed a similarly devastating barrage, striking the attackers caught in open ground. The men who tried to duck behind vehicles discovered that the angles of fire had been carefully calculated, leaving few safe spots. The previously calm farmland was now a symphony of sporadic gunfire, screams, and the acrid tang of gunpowder. Smoke wafted from the scorched patches of earth where the mines had detonated. Yet not all the cartel enforcers were hapless. A handful, likely experienced mercenaries or ex-military types, acted quickly under fire. 2 or 3 men advanced in low crouches, rolling and sprinting from one cover to another while methodically taking aim at the turrets. Scott saw the sparks fly as bullets pinged against the metal frames of his hidden guns, and he recognized that sooner or later, the men might disable them if not stopped. He steadied the sniper rifle and took careful aim at the first skilled shooter. His breath was slow and controlled, his finger taut on the trigger. With a single shot, he ended the threat, sending the man collapsing onto the dirt. The second advanced shooter peered around a scorched truck, possibly trying to locate the sniper's nest. Another measured shot from Scott's vantage point sent that man to the ground, leaving only a few scattered individuals who appeared disoriented. No more than a handful still stood, likely no more than 5 or 6 from the original 20. They exchanged frantic signals, probably determining that retreat was the only option. But as they dashed back toward the waiting vehicles, they discovered that the remote-controlled turrets had not fallen silent. Another burst of gunfire rained down on them, felling 2 more. One tried to hide behind the nearest truck, but the path back led him over a patch of ground rigged with smaller explosive devices. A muffled explosion jolted the air, and he vanished in a plume of smoke. When the noise finally waned, only 2 individuals were left moving with any semblance of intent, crouching low in the tall grass. Scott watched them through his scope. They were armed, but clearly rattled. One gestured to the other as if urging a desperate flank maneuver, possibly to take a position behind the barn. Scott exhaled, positioned the crosshairs, and squeezed the trigger. A thunderclap echoed across the land, and the second-to-last cartel member dropped instantly, struck with lethal precision. The sole remaining gunman dove to the ground and attempted to crawl for cover. Scott readjusted his angle, finding the right vantage point through a narrow gap in the barn's roof. He aimed lower, aligning the crosshairs with the man's leg to wound rather than kill. The shot rang out, connecting with bone. The man's anguished cry rose above the fading echoes of battle, and he rolled onto his back, clutching the wound. Scott paused a moment, scanning the area for any additional threats. Smoke hovered in layers, and the ground was littered with debris from exploded mines, spent shells, and the crumpled forms of fallen attackers. Satisfied that no immediate threat remained, he secured the sniper rifle and descended from the barn, moving with a cautious yet controlled stride. His boots crunched over gravel and broken glass as he moved across the farmyard, passing the remains of vehicles peppered with bullet holes. The acrid smell of burnt gunpowder lingered around him. In the distance, a couple of men still breathed, their injuries severe, yet none appeared able to lift a weapon. The final gunman lay near a swath of blood-stained grass, trembling as he fought the agony in his leg. Approaching at a measured pace, Scott kept an eye on the wounded man's hands, ensuring no last-ditch attempt at retaliation. Over the man's labored panting, a faint sound of static emerged from a radio device clipped to his belt. The injured attacker appeared to realize that his boss was calling to demand an update. He fumbled for the radio, only to find Scott's hand already taking it. A voice crackled over the channel. The tone was harsh, demanding a situation report. Scott allowed a moment to pass before responding in a low, steeled tone that conveyed finality. He announced that the men who had come were either dead or incapacitated, and he implied that the cartel's hostility had sealed its own fate. The radio went silent, as though the person on the other end was absorbing the reality that an entire crew had been decimated. Before discarding the radio, Scott glanced down at the wounded man who now lay helpless in the dirt. The man muttered something under his breath, a final confession of fear and an admission that the cartel would pursue this vendetta to the end. Scott gleaned from the man's trembling words that the powerful figure behind these attacks was a local kingpin known for swift retaliation. But he also picked up a trace of surprise in the man's eyes, an astonishment that an unassuming farmer could orchestrate such a brutal defense. Scott walked away, leaving the man groaning in pain, and let the radio tumble from his fingers. The confrontation had ended, but he was fully aware that his actions had now drawn a direct line between himself and the cartel's leadership. There was no guarantee they would cease their aggression, more likely, they would renew it with greater force. Inside the barn, he took a moment to breathe, leaning against a support beam as the adrenaline drained from his system. The presence of so many lifeless bodies on his land troubled him, no matter how justified the violence had been. This was a farm that grew life, crops, trees, animals, yet it had become a battlefield where men came to kill or be killed. He felt tension in his spine, a heavy weight settling between his shoulder blades. His mind reeled with the knowledge that the cartel leader would not simply forget this humiliation. He recalled what he had told the distant voice over the radio. He had stated that he would come after the one who orchestrated these attacks. Implicit in that declaration was a promise of confrontation, an inevitable collision that might only be settled when one of them lay dead. Dusk began to color the horizon, painting the farm in a mixture of solemn shadows. Scott spent several hours tending to the perimeter again, disabling the traps that still lay armed and clearing any immediate hazards that might harm passing wildlife or curious neighbors. He also collected weapons from the fallen attackers, piling them in the barn, unsure yet what he would do with them. The scene felt surreal, as though he had stepped away from the calm life of planting crops into the realm of a war zone. Yet, as night fell, the quiet returned, more profound than before. The stars shimmered overhead, indifferent to the day's carnage. Scott found himself thinking about his parents, about how they had worked this very soil to cultivate rare and precious plants. He wondered if they would have recognized him now, the farmer-turned-warrior forced to defend their legacy. His arms bore small scratches and bruises from the day's skirmish, though none so serious that they hindered his movements. While cleaning his hands at an outdoor spigot, he noticed the water washing away not just dirt but also flecks of dried blood. The swirl of red-brown in the draining water made him realize how far he had traveled from the peaceful existence he once valued. In a moment of self-reflection, he decided there was no returning to that innocence. The path had been chosen by the cartel's aggression, and he had only two options: protect what was his or abandon everything. He stepped into the farmhouse and double-checked that all entrances were secured. The old wooden door, polished by years of wear, felt solid beneath his hand. Inside, the house seemed unusually silent. He moved through the modest living room where family photographs still hung, tracing in his memory the gentle smiles of his mother and father. He paused near a framed photograph of himself from a movie premiere, standing beside co-stars and wearing a sharp suit. Those days of choreographed fights and staged stunts felt shallow compared to the all-too-real combat he had witnessed. Sleep did not come easily. His mind replayed the events, the percussive blasts of mines, the muzzle flashes in the twilight, and the sharp cries of wounded attackers. He recognized that surviving this assault would only embolden the cartel's leader to strike with even greater force. If the organization had been willing to deploy over 20 armed men for a single mission, there was no telling what resources they would allocate next. In the morning, the day broke with a vibrant sunrise that clashed almost mockingly with the aftermath of the night's violence. Smoke still clung to certain patches of earth. The battered trucks remained near the fence line, their owners no longer alive to drive them. Scott contacted the sheriff's department to inform them of the incident. He mentioned that multiple trespassers had launched an armed assault and that lethal defenses had been deployed in self-defense. The sheriff, upon arrival, was met with a grim tableau. While official statements would inevitably follow, it was apparent to all that a war had touched down on the Adkins farm. The sheriff could do little beyond methodically photographing the scene, calling for coroners, and staring with a mixture of disbelief and concern at Scott, who remained stoic by the barn. Through hushed conversation, the lawman acknowledged that the cartel leader had undoubtedly learned of this massacre by now. The sheriff suggested that Scott consider leaving the area or at least obtaining immediate police protection. However, neither proposition seemed viable. Police resources were limited, especially in a region stretched thin by distant issues, and relying on official protection might only bring more people into danger. Scott accepted the necessity of what had happened. The men who died made their choice by attacking a private farm with deadly intent. Yet, he felt no triumphant satisfaction. Violence was never something he had craved, it had been an ugly means to a necessary end. Once the investigators cleared the immediate area, he planned a trip of his own. In his mind, the next step was clear. He had told the cartel over the radio that he would go to them, and he intended to keep that promise. An attack on the ranch had already happened twice, and waiting passively for a third wave would only invite more destruction. He returned inside the barn, where he examined the arsenal left behind by the defeated men. Among the scattered firearms and ammunition, he found some documents in one of their trucks, crumbled notes with addresses and phone numbers, possibly linked to the cartel's local safe houses or supply lines. He realized that confronting the leader meant leaving his land for a brief time, stepping away from the soil he was sworn to protect. But if he succeeded in eliminating the head of the snake, so to speak, the cartel's will to pursue him might collapse. Before embarking on that perilous path, he took care of the farm. He walked the rows, checking on the fragile seedlings that needed attention even in the aftermath of bloodshed. He watered them meticulously and ensured each greenhouse was sealed properly for the night. The orchard trees, some bearing the first signs of fruit, reminded him that life persisted. Even amidst chaos, new growth was always possible. By midday, the sun was strong, casting harsh light upon the scorched earth near the boundary fence. It revealed the land's wounds, which would take time and effort to repair. The barn structure had sustained minimal damage, but pockmarks from stray bullets marred its exterior. He took note of everything that would require fixing once the threat was eliminated: fence repairs, new layers of paint, and the replanting of shrubs or grass in areas torn up by explosions. After gathering supplies for a journey, he locked the farmhouse. In a practical sense, it felt futile, since determined intruders could force entry. Yet it was a symbolic act, one that reminded him of his bond to the place. If fate demanded he confront the cartel's leader on distant ground, he intended to return here afterward. The red front door that had been a cheerful fixture in his childhood was now a reminder of what he stood to lose if he faltered. He placed a few personal items into a sturdy backpack, extra clothing, medical supplies, and a length of rope that might prove useful. He also packed a compact sidearm and ammunition, though he preferred not to rely on firearms if a close-quarters fight became inevitable. His martial discipline remained the core of his combat identity, and he trusted it more than he did any mechanical device. Glancing around one last time, he paused by the porch, where an old rocking chair creaked in the light breeze. He remembered his mother sitting there on warm afternoons, enjoying the tranquil sway. The memory anchored him to the land, reminding him of his deeper purpose. He allowed a final breath of the farm's air to fill his lungs and then began the walk toward his truck, parked under a nearby canopy of trees. The drive ahead would take him through small towns and dusty backroads. His destination was uncertain, but the scraps of information he had collected gave him a place to start. If the cartel had a known compound or stronghold, that was likely where their leader would be. Scott recognized that going alone was risky, perhaps foolish in the eyes of many. But accepting outside help meant endangering more lives, and he refused to let others become collateral in a personal vendetta. As he accelerated down the rural lane that led from the farm, he kept his eyes flicking between the rearview mirror and the road ahead. A swirl of dust trailed the vehicle, temporarily obscuring the green fields he left behind. The horizon beckoned with pale, sunlit hills and the promise of confrontation. His heart pounded with a mixture of resolve and residual anger, each beat echoing the vow he had made. He would put an end to this threat, ensure no more attacks targeted his homestead, and bring closure to a conflict that had threatened to consume him. Far behind him, the fields remained silent except for the whispers of the wind. Thin tendrils of smoke from burnt patches drifted lazily upward, blending into the bright expanse of afternoon sky. The land seemed indifferent to the struggle of men, continuing its perpetual cycle of growth and renewal. Despite the grim setting, the orchard trees still bore fruit, and the seeds in the greenhouse still sprouted. Life carried on, awaiting his return. Scott navigated the winding roads with careful determination, consulting the fragments of information he had recovered from the attacker's notes. Despite the bright sun illuminating the countryside, an undercurrent of tension flowed beneath his calm demeanor. He kept a mental record of every landmark and every turn, piecing together the route that would lead him deep into hostile territory. While he might have preferred stealth to a direct assault, the names and addresses on those smudged papers seemed to offer only one real solution: confront the danger at its source. Each small town he passed felt sleepier than the last, populated by rural families who likely had no clue about the looming violence. They busied themselves with daily life, selling produce at roadside stands, tinkering with battered trucks, or gathering at local diners. Passing these scenes, Scott wondered if any of them had unknowingly brushed shoulders with the same cartel that now threatened him. Hidden in the background, criminal networks could thrive even in places that seemed quiet and unassuming. He stopped briefly in a dusty little hamlet, parking his truck near a modest diner with a faded sign. The swirling dust of his arrival caught a few curious glances, but no one approached him. Inside, he ordered black coffee and took a corner seat, the subdued murmurs of other patrons drifting around him. He let the warmth of the brew settle his nerves, then unfolded the crumpled sheet of paper on the table. It bore partial directions, likely describing a turn off the main highway, leading to a remote compound or safe house. A waitress, unassuming and polite, refilled his cup without asking questions. Scott offered a silent nod of thanks. Though he felt momentary guilt at the thought of bringing trouble into such a peaceful place, he reminded himself that his presence there would be fleeting. He finished his coffee quickly and left a generous tip, then stepped back into the glaring sun. His mind replayed the violence on the farm, the rage on the faces of the men who had attacked, and the lifeless stares of those who never made it out alive. They had come uninvited to his land, seeking to destroy everything he held dear. Now the tables had turned, and he was the one hunting. Once back on the road, he followed a narrow stretch of asphalt that soon became a dusty track. Patches of scrub and jagged rock replaced the open fields he was accustomed to seeing around his own property. The terrain felt increasingly desolate, far from the watchful eyes of law enforcement. In this rugged expanse, trucks full of armed men could slip by unnoticed. The cartel's operations would face little interference here. He drove for hours, recalling details from his notes whenever the trail split or forked. Occasional weather-beaten signs hinted at abandoned farms or small ranches once owned by families who had since moved on, possibly chased out by economic hardship or intimidation. He observed a few scattered structures on the horizon, dilapidated barns, rusting vehicles, and vacant houses. Though the place might have been teeming with life in past decades, it now seemed abandoned, as if nature itself were reclaiming the land. By mid-afternoon, the sky had turned into a bright canvas of searing blue, and the heat beat down relentlessly. He felt sweat gathering beneath his shirt, yet he kept the windows rolled up to maintain a sense of security. Near a long stretch of sun-baked earth, he spotted two black SUVs parked side by side. Their sleek presence felt out of place amid the dusty surroundings. Deciding not to drive any closer, he guided his truck off the road, maneuvering it behind a low ridge that could offer some concealment. He shut off the engine and scanned the area with a compact pair of binoculars. A small structure lay ahead, a rectangular building with boarded-up windows and a sagging roof. It might have once served as a farmhouse, but any vestige of pastoral charm had been overshadowed by evidence of illicit activity. Pieces of heavy equipment lined the property, some wrapped in tattered tarps, others left exposed. He observed faint movement near the porch, shadowy figures periodically stepping outside, then ducking back in. It matched the profile of a cartel hideout, remote, fortified by lookouts, and used for discreet storage or gatherings. He read the tension in the posture of the men he glimpsed, men who likely carried weapons and waited for instructions. Scott reflected on the documents in his possession. They hinted that a local enforcer, reporting directly to the cartel's leadership, might be stationed here. Taking that individual by surprise could yield information about the final destination he sought. Stepping out of his truck, he circled behind the ridge on foot, making sure the terrain would shield him from any patrolling guards. Each footfall kicked up small clouds of dust, forcing him to move slowly. The sun's relentless glare made it difficult to maintain a low profile, but he pressed on, using sparse shrubs and the uneven contours of the land to his advantage. Cresting a low rise, he gained a clearer view of the building's perimeter. At least 2 guards stood outside, one leaning against the wall while the other circled near the SUVs. They wore civilian clothes, jeans, short-sleeved shirts, but both carried visible firearms slung across their chests. Their stances suggested training, or at least familiarity with violent scenarios. Underestimating them could prove fatal. Scott retrieved a pair of gloves from his backpack and tightened them, a simple action that helped focus his mind. While he preferred direct confrontation to infiltration, charging 2 armed men in broad daylight was a poor strategy. He waited, observing the pattern of their movements. The first guard paced back and forth, occasionally wiping sweat from his brow. The second seemed more relaxed, fiddling with a small radio or phone, at times drifting toward the SUVs. A plan formed in Scott's mind: approach at an angle that would put one guard's line of sight onto the building itself, using the corner of the structure to block visibility. If executed perfectly, he might neutralize the second guard without alerting the first. The risk was substantial, but so was every step of this mission. He crouched low and began a steady advance. At one point, he nearly froze in place when the pacing guard paused and glanced outward, perhaps sensing a shift in the wind or a flicker of movement. Scott stayed motionless for several seconds, heart pounding, until the guard resumed his routine. Slowly, Scott pressed forward once more, eventually reaching a battered section of fence behind the building. Slipping through the broken boards, he found a vantage point near a rusted tractor that provided partial cover. At that moment, the second guard separated from the SUVs and headed around the corner of the building, an opportune isolation. Scott seized the chance. Timing his approach so he could close the distance before the guard realized he was not alone. In a swift, practiced maneuver, he clamped one arm around the guard's neck, using his free hand to shove the man's weapon aside. The guard struggled, attempting to cry out, but Scott applied pressure at the right points to suppress any noise. After a few seconds of frantic resistance, the guard's body went limp. Scott eased him to the ground, ensuring the unconscious man's fall made minimal sound. He retrieved the guard's firearm, checking the safety and setting it aside ere the man couldn't easily reach it if he awakened. Then, with equal caution, he continued along the wall until he reached a window that had been boarded from the inside. He pressed an ear to a gap between the boards, catching faint murmurs of conversation. The voices were tense, perhaps concerned about something happening elsewhere. The other guard was still out front, and there might be more men inside. Scott's mind raced with possibilities. Perhaps he could incapacitate the front guard just as quietly. Yet if others lurked inside the building, they might see or hear. A direct approach would invite a barrage of bullets. Another option was to draw the guard around the side by creating a diversion. He scanned the ground for a suitable distraction, loose stones, debris, anything that could produce a sound. Eventually, he found a small, rusted metal fragment from the tractor. He tossed it near the corner, hoping the clatter would lure the second guard away from the main entrance. He waited, each second stretching as the clang echoed across the yard. Sure enough, the guard moved cautiously around the porch, weapon raised, investigating. Scott prepared to strike, but at the last moment, he heard footsteps from inside the building. Another individual stepped outside, calling for the guard in a tone that suggested impatience. Though Scott could not distinguish the exact words, he recognized the tension. The ruse had partially worked, but now a third man was on the scene. While the guard peered around the corner, the newly emerged figure stood on the porch, scanning the yard. Scott remained hidden behind a cluster of debris. He knew he could not wait indefinitely. Eventually, the situation would worsen as more men came outside or discovered their unconscious companion. He crept forward, inches at a time, until he caught a glimpse of the porch. The second figure stood with his back turned, holding what looked like a small submachine gun. A potent threat if engaged head-on. Scott assessed the geometry of the space. The guard by the corner was only a few steps away. If Scott tried to neutralize one, the other would almost certainly notice. Suddenly, the unconscious guard behind the building groaned, stirring back to a state of half-awareness. The sound echoed faintly in the still air. Both men outside reacted, turning their heads in alarm. In that split second of distraction, Scott sprang from cover, delivering a rapid strike to the corner guard's arm to knock the weapon aside. The guard tried to fire, but the muzzle jerked upward, sending bullets harmlessly into the sky. Scott followed with a precise elbow to the jaw, driving the guard into the wall. Before the man could recover, Scott pivoted to confront the second individual, who now spun toward him, submachine gun in hand. A surge of adrenaline propelled Scott's movements. He dropped low, sweeping the muzzle away as the weapon discharged. Bullets sprayed into a wooden post, splintering it. Scott wrenched the gun downward, twisting it from the man's grip. The submachine gun clattered to the ground, its strap snapping tight around the attacker's shoulder. Reacting instinctively, the man lunged for a combat knife at his belt. Scott responded with a swift kick to the ribs, forcing the man to stagger back. Another blow to the wrist knocked the knife free. In a final move, Scott gripped the man's shirt and drove him headlong into the porch railing. The attacker collapsed, gasping for breath. Any chance of secrecy was gone now. The commotion of gunfire and scuffling had undoubtedly alerted those inside. Scott heard muffled shouts through the boarded windows and the frantic movements of more men rushing to secure the exits. He grabbed the fallen submachine gun, checked its remaining ammo, and braced himself by the front door. The handle turned from the inside, someone was trying to exit. Scott kicked the door inward, using the momentum to knock an unseen assailant off balance. Then he dropped to one knee and let loose a short burst from the submachine gun, spraying into the room. Shouts and curses erupted in the gloom, accompanied by flashes of muzzle fire as at least two men returned fire. Bullets thudded into the door frame, sending splinters sailing over Scott's shoulders. He rolled to one side, chest pressed to the floor, exchanging another burst. The muzzle flashes illuminated a cramped interior cluttered with crates, tables, and flickering overhead lights. One silhouette dropped near a stack of boxes, another ducked behind a wooden pillar. Scott advanced, weaving between cover points, mindful of the submachine gun's limited magazine capacity. A figure lunged at him from a blind spot, brandishing a sawed-off shotgun. The blast roared, peppering a nearby wall with buckshot. Scott evaded the brunt of it, though a few pellets grazed his shoulder. Gritting his teeth against the sting, he thrust the submachine gun's barrel into the attacker's chest, forcing them back. A quick pull of the trigger ended the threat. Smoke and the metallic scent of gunpowder filled the space. Scott, breathing heavily, scanned for more. A dark shape emerged from behind the pillar, pistol raised. The muzzle flashed twice, and Scott felt a searing line across his upper arm. He dropped low, returning fire with the last rounds in his magazine. The shape collapsed, knocking over a battered table as it fell. Silence followed, broken only by the whimpering of a wounded man somewhere in the shadows. Scott set aside the now empty submachine gun, reached for his sidearm, and cautiously stepped around the debris. The building's interior was a disordered mess, evidence of a makeshift storage or safe house. Splintered crates, scattered documents, and appended chairs littered the floor. Among the wreckage, he spotted a battered metal desk. He inched closer, scanning around corners, pistol at the ready. A pained cough drew his attention to the desk. Behind it, one of the men he had just shot lay clutching his torso. Blood pooled beneath him, and his breathing was labored. Catching sight of Scott, the man raised a trembling hand in a feeble gesture. Though no direct words were exchanged, it was clear he had no strength left for further combat. From the look of the place, and the limited guards, Scott guessed this was not the main compound. Possibly just an outpost. He rifled through the documents strewn on the floor, flipping pages of ledgers and odd scraps of handwritten notes, searching for any direct reference to the cartel leader. The faint ring of a phone startled him. Somewhere deeper in the building, a landline or cell phone persisted in its insistent chime. He followed the sound into a back room separated by a torn curtain. Inside, the smell of stale smoke and spilled alcohol hung in the air. A single naked light bulb cast harsh shadows on the walls. He found a table covered in more papers, a laptop with a cracked screen, and a ringing phone on top of a half-open drawer. Still gripping his pistol, he picked up the phone. He could hear static and faint voices on the other end. Perhaps the men who had been outside were expected to check in, or the caller sensed something had gone wrong. Scott's eyes flicked over a scrawled address on a notepad lying next to the phone. It matched the name of a ranch that had been mentioned in one of his stolen documents, a place reputedly under the direct control of the cartel boss. He dropped the phone back on its cradle, cutting the connection. Outside, he heard an engine turning over. Another occupant of the building, apparently hiding until now, was making a desperate attempt to escape in one of the SUVs. Scott rushed back through the labyrinth of overturned crates and bodies. His shoulder still bled from buckshot grazes, and each movement sent twinges of pain radiating up his arm. Emerging onto the porch, he spotted an SUV peeling away in a flurry of dust. The guard he had left unconscious earlier must have come to and seized the opportunity. Though he could have attempted a shot at the fleeing vehicle, he let it go. The occupant would likely alert the cartel that their outpost had been compromised, but the cartel already knew it was at war with him. His priority was to find the final link, the location where the leader would inevitably be. He slipped back around to retrieve his own truck, stopping only to check whether the men he had disarmed were truly out of commission. One unconscious guard still lay in the dust, while the others remained scattered and unmoving. Scott considered interrogating the guard for more precise directions but decided the fresh intel on the notepad was likely more reliable. Climbing into his truck, he pressed a hand to his shoulder wound to stem the bleeding. His thoughts dwelled on the biggest challenge yet, confronting the leader, the mastermind who had ordered the attacks on his home. If the boss had set a bounty on Scott's head, he would surely be well protected, surrounded by henchmen armed to the teeth. Yet Scott reminded himself that direct infiltration remained his best chance. Another wave of gunmen arriving at his farm in his absence could be catastrophic, unless he eliminated the threat at its very root. He drove deeper into the wilderness. Sparse tufts of vegetation poked through the arid ground, and rocky outcrops jutted up like watchful sentinels. The address from the notepad pointed him toward an abandoned ranch once owned by a family that had disappeared from county records over a decade ago. Rumor attributed the property's decline to criminal takeover, but few dared to mention it openly. The sky evolved into a molten orange as late afternoon stretched toward evening, painting the horizon with streaks of fire. Scott knew dusk would bring some advantage, cloaking his approach if he timed it right. But it also meant he would be fighting in low visibility, a risk if the enemy had night vision gear. Still, he pushed onward. Eventually, the dirt path intersected with a wrought iron gate that looked both newly reinforced and ominously silent. On the other side lay a sprawling property, ringed by tall fences and sporadic floodlights. Old corrals and horse stables had been converted into a semblance of a fortress. Wooden watchtowers rose near the perimeter, and he spotted armed lookouts pacing the platforms. This was no mere hideout, it was a heavily guarded compound. He killed the truck's engine before the gate came fully into view, positioning the vehicle behind a natural rise in the terrain. From there, he surveyed the site through binoculars. He counted at least 4 tower guards, each likely armed with rifles. A half-dozen men patrolled near the main building, which stood at the heart of the compound like a foreboding manor. Lights glimmered in its windows, and movement inside suggested a small army going about its business. Though outnumbered, he had surprise on his side. The men at the outpost might have relayed a warning about an intruder, but the large facility gave Scott opportunities for stealth. He gathered what gear he could carry, spare magazines for his pistol, a few small explosives he had packed in anticipation of breaching obstacles, and a dark hooded jacket to blend into the encroaching night. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving a twilight glow that softened each silhouette. Keeping his posture low, he advanced through the rocky field that buffered the ranch. Occasional bursts of wind carried dust across his path, further reducing visibility for both him and the watchers in the towers. He crept closer, pausing whenever a floodlight swept across the fence line. Near the compound's rear section, he discovered a section of fence less illuminated than the rest. A scattering of old farm equipment, rusting plows and broken wagons, sat against the perimeter, offering partial cover. Scott crouched behind them, considering his options for entry. Cutting the fence would create noise and risk immediate detection. Attempting to climb it might also expose him to a guard's rifle scope. He retrieved one of his small explosives. A shaped charge carefully rigged to blow a controlled hole. He placed it at a structural joint of the fence, applied a quick-release adhesive to secure it, and threaded the detonator through. With a silent prayer that the blast would be as contained as designed, he flicked the switch on a short timer and darted behind the old plow. A muted thump reverberated, accompanied by a flash of light. The portion of fence he had targeted crumpled, twisted metal creating a gap wide enough to slip through. He waited, tense, listening for alarms or shouts. One guard in a distant tower appeared to turn in that direction, shining a flashlight briefly over the fence line, but the heavy equipment seemed to shield the breach from direct view. Emboldened by the lack of an immediate response, Scott slipped through the mangled fence, pistol ready. The ranch yard stretched out before him in half-darkness. He moved along the fence's interior perimeter, hugging shadows cast by disused trailers and small outbuildings. Each step could reveal him if timed poorly with the patrols, so he paused often, ears straining for footsteps or radio chatter. A pair of guards strode past about 20 yards away, their conversation muffled by the wind. They vanished behind a storage shed, heading toward the main house. Seizing the moment, Scott sprinted silently to a row of large hay bales stacked against an old barn. The barn's sliding door hung ajar, providing an unguarded entry into whatever lay inside. He eased the door open just enough to slip through, scanning the interior with a quick sweep of his pistol. Moonlight filtered through gaps in the roof, revealing a space cluttered with crates and barrels. Some bore markings that hinted at contraband, possibly drugs or weapons. The smell of oil and chemicals hung in the stale air. He advanced, searching for an exit that might lead him closer to the main house. Midway through the barn, he heard footsteps and hushed voices outside, prompting him to crouch behind a stack of crates. 2 armed men entered the barn, flashlights dancing across the dusty floor. They seemed to be scanning for any sign of intrusion. Scott considered engaging them, but any gunfire could draw more attention. Instead, he moved slowly, keeping the crates between him and the beams of light. The men spoke in low tones, referencing a name that Scott recognized as belonging to a senior cartel member. They mentioned something about the boss expecting an update soon, suggesting he was indeed on the premises. Then one of them paused, shining the flashlight onto the ground near the door, discovering fresh footprints in the dirt, Scott's footprints. Alerted, the men raised their weapons, scanning the barn with renewed urgency. Scott pressed himself behind the crates, counting their steps as they approached. One man advanced directly toward him, the flashlight beam flickering across the boxes. Time slowed. Scott waited until the man was nearly upon him, then burst out, grabbing the guard's weapon at the muzzle to redirect it. The guard pulled the trigger, a deafening shot firing harmlessly into the ceiling. Simultaneously, Scott delivered a punishing blow to the guard's jaw. The second man whirled and shot blindly into the gloom. Scott ducked, feeling a bullet whiz overhead. He slammed the butt of the first guard's rifle into the second man's torso, knocking the wind out of him. A quick pivot and elbow strike sent the man sprawling. Before either guard could recover, Scott subdued them with precise strikes to the temple. He stood there, breath ragged, tension buzzing in every nerve. Any hope of a silent infiltration had vanished. The gunshots in the barn were sure to draw more patrols. Without pause, he took one of the guard's rifles, loaded, but carrying limited ammo, and set his sights on the far side of the barn, where a smaller doorway led out. He sprinted for it, forging ahead with the knowledge that each second counted before reinforcements closed in. Emerging behind the barn, he found himself in a dim courtyard directly facing the main house. Lights glowed through the windows, and he could see shapes moving inside. He pressed himself against a low stone wall to survey the building's exterior. Several cars and SUVs were parked out front, and at least 4 more armed men patrolled the grounds. A volley of shouts confirmed that the guards had discovered the incapacitated men in the barn or the hole in the fence. Footsteps thundered on gravel, accompanied by the glare of flashlights sweeping across the yard. Realizing he was about to be encircled, Scott decided on a bold move. He lobbed one of his small explosives toward a cluster of vehicles, hoping the blast would create enough chaos to draw guards away from the house. A thunderous detonation ripped through the night, flames licking upward as a car's fuel tank ignited. The yard was flooded with flickering orange light, and the air was split by the startled shouts of men diving for cover. Under the umbrella of this distraction, Scott darted toward a side entrance of the house. He reached a wooden door, rattled the knob, locked. With a forceful kick, he splintered it. Inside, a narrow hallway led deeper into the structure. An acrid smell of old tobacco and mildew assailed him. He advanced, rifle held at chest level, scanning each corner. Distantly, he could hear more explosions, perhaps the chain reaction of burning vehicles, and the frantic crackle of radios as guards tried to coordinate. A figure emerged at the end of the hall, brandishing a handgun. Scott dropped to one knee and fired. The shots reverberated in the confined space, bright muzzle flashes lighting the corridor. The attacker fell with a ragged cry. Scott continued forward, stepping carefully around the body, adrenaline driving him ever closer to the heart of the compound. Door after door led to rooms in disarray, an office filled with half-burned documents, a lounge area strewn with empty bottles, a storage room stacked with weapons crates. Occasional gunshots echoed from outside, but the interior seemed eerily deserted. At last, he reached a broad staircase leading to the second floor. He ascended, each step echoing in the hush. Upstairs, the hallway was wide, lit by a single hanging lamp that cast harsh shadows on faded wallpaper. He glimpsed a figure at the far end, someone who moved with a different bearing, poised and unhurried. This individual took a step back into a room, out of sight. Scott advanced, heart thundering. He suspected this was not a common guard. Turning the corner, he entered what appeared to be a spacious bedroom or private suite. Luxurious furniture contrasted with the dilapidated state of the rest of the property. A plush carpet muffled his footsteps. In the center of the room stood a tall man with slicked back hair, wearing a crisp shirt and gleaming shoes, as if he had just left a business meeting. A pistol rested in a holster at his side, and a short, curved blade was tucked into his belt. Though Scott loathed direct speech, the tension in the man's expression made his intentions clear. He exuded power and menace, the hallmark of someone unaccustomed to hearing the word no. Likely the cartel boss himself, the one whose orders had unleashed so much bloodshed. The man reached for his pistol, but Scott leveled the rifle. They both froze in a moment of mutual assessment. The boss's eyes flicked to the hallway behind Scott, perhaps calculating if more of his men were approaching. Realizing the precarious balance, Scott moved first, firing a controlled burst. The boss dove behind an ornate dresser, the bullet sending splinters through the air. Scott darted to the side, taking cover behind an overturned table. The boss emerged from behind the dresser, pistol barking out a trio of shots. One bullet smacked into the wall near Scott, showering him with plaster dust. Another buried itself in the table. Scott heard the click of an empty mag. The boss cursed under his breath, discarding the sidearm. Seizing the opening, Scott rushed forward. The boss tugged the curved blade from his belt, meeting Scott's assault with a slash aimed at his midsection. Scott twisted his torso, avoiding the lethal slice by inches, and swung the rifle stock at the man's wrist. The blade clattered to the floor. Yet the boss proved agile, driving a punch into Scott's injured shoulder. Pain flared white-hot. But Scott powered through, using an elbow strike that connected with the man's ribs. They grappled, crashing against a framed mirror that shattered around them. Glass fragments rained onto the carpet. In the chaos, the boss landed a sharp blow to Scott's jaw, momentarily dazing him. Seizing advantage, the man wrested the rifle away, hurling it aside. Scott responded by grabbing the boss's arm, pulling him off balance, then unleashing a knee into his abdomen. The force made the boss double over. They both stumbled, slick with sweat and surrounded by the debris of shattered furniture. The fight was primal now, two bodies straining for control. Scott's mind slipped into the disciplined calm that had guided him through countless hours of martial arts training. The boss aimed another desperate punch, but Scott intercepted it, twisting the arm into a joint lock that elicited a crack of strained ligaments. A swift follow-up strike toppled the boss to the floor. He gasped, eyes wild with defiance. Scott pinned him, forcing his arm behind his back until he heard the man's muffled groan of agony. A final well-placed strike behind the ear silenced further resistance. The confrontation ended abruptly. Scott knelt on the plush carpet, panting, the boss lying unconscious beneath him. Gunfire in the courtyard had quieted, replaced by the distant crackle of flames where vehicles still burned. Bit by bit, Scott's surroundings came into focus, the flickering shadows on the walls, the crushed remains of shattered furniture, the broken glass glinting under the overhead light. He took a moment to regain his composure, aware that any number of survivors might yet be searching for him in the compound. But the main objective lay at his feet, the ruthless puppet master who had orchestrated attacks on innocent people, who had placed a bounty on Scott's head and threatened his farm. Now that the boss was defeated, the organization might collapse under the weight of its losses. Securing the man's wrists with a piece of torn fabric, Scott listened to the distant footfalls of frantic survivors scurrying outside. He contemplated simply finishing the job here, but the boss was unconscious and posed no immediate threat. Instead, he rose, battered and exhausted, and made his way back downstairs. He needed to exit quickly, before reinforcements arrived in overwhelming numbers. Fires still raged near the main gate. The headlights of multiple vehicles revealed silhouettes racing about in confusion. Scott stayed low, circling to the gap in the fence he had created. A few stray shots split the night, but no one seemed to pinpoint his location. He reached the fence line, slid through the opening, and vanished into the darkness beyond. Minutes later, he found his truck where he had left it. Straining from the pain in his shoulder, he climbed into the driver's seat. The adrenaline that had fueled him was wearing off, leaving him aware of every bruise, cut, and burn. Yet a deep sense of resolution steadied his grip on the steering wheel. The leader was beaten, the chain of command severed. Whatever remnants of the cartel remained would likely turn inward, dealing with their own internal power struggles. He drove through the night, guided only by moonlight and a few scattered stars. The horizon gradually lightened with the approach of dawn, revealing the silhouettes of low hills and fields. By the time the first hint of morning painted the sky, he was back in familiar territory, the farmland he knew so intimately. His truck rolled up the dirt path to his homestead, and the sight of the old farmhouse brought a rush of relief. Though bullet-scarred and disturbed by traps, it was still his home, still the land he had pledged to protect. He pulled to a stop, stepped out, and let the early sunlight wash over him. The intense pink-orange glow illuminated the fields, and he felt the tension in his heart begin to ease. The orchard still stood, resilient as ever, with the trees' branches swaying gently in the dawn breeze. The greenhouse, though peppered with bullet holes in places, remained mostly intact, nurturing the rare and delicate crops Scott had devoted so much care to. Through the pain and the exhaustion, he felt a quiet pride in having defended this place. He made his way to the farmhouse porch, where the rocking chair sat just as it always had. Lowering himself onto it, he exhaled a long, weary breath. The horizon radiated with a soft gold that signaled another day of work for an honest farmer. Yet in this moment, he allowed himself the luxury of rest, the reward for a perilous mission completed. As minutes passed, the sun rose higher, revealing a scene that seemed impossibly tranquil given the violence of the preceding days. A few songbirds flitted among the fence posts, seemingly unaware of the recent battle. Inhaling the crisp morning air, Scott reflected on the steps that had led him here, the forced confrontation with thugs, the lethal defense of his land, the infiltration of the cartel stronghold, and finally, the confrontation with the boss himself. Each ordeal had tested his resolve and skill. Now, with the ringleader defeated, the threat would surely subside. The bounty on his head might vanish or grow moot if the cartel fractured under leadership disputes. Though nothing was guaranteed, he held on to hope that his stand had made his farmland safe again. He would remain vigilant, but the promise of normalcy beckoned him with each rustle of the orchard's leaves. In those quiet moments on the porch, he remembered the smiles of his parents, the lessons they had taught him about patience and perseverance. He envisioned them watching from somewhere far away, seeing the farm endure through every hardship. He imagined them at peace, proud that he had stayed true to his word, protecting the soil they had so carefully cultivated. He watched the sun crest fully over the horizon, and the day began in earnest. There would be fences to mend, traps to dismantle, and fields to restore. Animals would need feeding, and the orchard required tending. He could almost hear his father's gentle admonition not to tarry too long in one spot. Yet, for a few minutes more, he allowed himself to remain still, soaking in the warmth of the morning. With a careful roll of his injured shoulder, he reminded himself to tend to his own wounds as well. His clothes were torn, flecked with blood and grime, but he was alive, and the farm still stood. The next hours would require some measure of healing, both for the land and for him. The memory of the cartel's aggression would linger, but he had laid down a clear warning for any who would challenge him again. The sun now shone with full radiance, bathing the fields in brilliant light. The orchard leaves glimmered, and the tall grasses near the barn swayed in unison. Every breath felt charged with the promise of renewal. Though the road had been arduous, Scott found solace in the knowledge that he had fulfilled his duty to protect what mattered most. In the distance, the sky revealed a gentle blue that merged with delicate wisps of cloud. The hush over the farmland carried its own reassurance. This land, his inheritance, had endured. With the dawn's arrival, he felt neither fear nor urgency, only the quiet satisfaction of a guardian returning to his rightful place. The rocking chair creaked softly under him, lulling him into a calmness that no city street or film set could ever match. A faint smile touched his lips as he watched the day unfold, crops stirring in the breeze, sunlight casting dancing patterns across the yard, and the gentle expanse of the horizon welcoming him home.